kind of woman looks a deadly warrior in the eyes and says, "You need someone like me." In a town where one wrong word can get you killed, a saloon girl takes the ultimate risk, and what happens next will change both of their lives forever. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The summer of 1867 burned across the Texas frontier with merciless intensity. Dust devils danced through the main street of Redemption, a rough settlement that had sprung up along the Brazos River, where civilization met the untamed expanse of Comanche. The town existed in that precarious space between two worlds, where white settlers built their dreams on land that had belonged to the Comanche for generations. The Red Rose Saloon stood at the heart of Redemption, a two-story structure of weathered wood that creaked in the hot wind. Inside, the air hung thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of whiskey. A piano player named Old Pete worked the keys with arthritic fingers, coaxing out melodies that spoke of lost loves and distant homes. Behind the bar, polishing glasses with methodical precision, stood Charlotte May Hendricks. At 24, she possessed the kind of beauty that made men forget their troubles, and their wives in equal measure. Her auburn hair cascaded past her shoulders in waves that caught the lamplight like burnished copper. Her eyes, green as prairie grass after spring rain, held an intelligence that most men either missed or chose to ignore. She wore a crimson dress that hugged her curves, the fabric imported from St. Louis at considerable expense. The dress was both armor and advertisement in a world where a woman alone had few choices. Charlotte had arrived in Redemption 3 years earlier with nothing but a carpet bag and a fierce determination to survive. She'd fled St. Louis after her father, a riverboat gambler, had drunk himself to death, leaving her with debts she couldn't pay and men who thought those debts gave them certain rights. The West had seemed like a place where a woman might remake herself, though she'd quickly learned that the frontier had its own harsh rules. She'd started as a serving girl, enduring the groping hands and crude proposals with a painted smile. But Charlotte was smart, smarter than most gave her credit for. She listened, learned, and saved every coin. Within a year, she'd convinced the previous owner, a tired widow named Mrs. Blackwood, to sell her a partnership. Now she effectively ran the Red Rose, and while the work was hard and the customers often difficult, it was hers. "Another whiskey, darlin'," called out Bull Reeves, a buffalo hunter whose stench preceded him into any room. His massive hands, stained with blood and powder, drummed impatiently on the bar. Charlotte poured with practiced ease, neither smile nor frown crossing her features. She'd learned to maintain a careful neutrality, to be friendly without being available, charming without making promises her circumstances might force her to keep. The saloon doors swung open with a crash that silenced the piano. 3 soldiers from Fort Griffin stumbled in, their blue uniforms dusty from the trail. The youngest couldn't have been more than 19, his face still soft with boyhood. The sergeant, a grizzled veteran with a scar bisecting his left cheek, surveyed the room with the wary eyes of a man who'd seen too much combat. "Whiskey," the sergeant demanded, slapping coins on the bar. "The real stuff, not that watered-down horse piss you serve the regulars." Charlotte poured from the good bottle, the one she kept for customers who could tell the difference and were willing to pay for it. "Rough patrol, Sergeant Hawkins." "Every patrol's rough these days," Hawkins muttered, downing his drink in one practiced motion. "Comanche are getting bolder. Hit a homestead 20 miles north yesterday. Killed the husband, took the wife and 2 children. We tracked them for half a day before we lost the trail in the rocks." A collective murmur rippled through the saloon. Fear was a constant companion in Redemption, but hearing it spoken aloud made it more real, more immediate. "Which band?" asked Clayton Wells, the town's blacksmith, a man whose arms were thick as tree trunks from years at the forge. "Hard to say for certain," Hawkins replied, accepting a refill from Charlotte. "But the scouts think it might be Tall Bear's group, and if the rumors are true, that means Gray Wolf is riding with them." The name fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of unease through the room. Gray Wolf. Even Charlotte, who'd made it a point not to involve herself in frontier politics or Indian wars, knew that name. He was a legend along the borderlands, a Comanche warrior whose reputation for cunning and ferocity had grown with each raid, each battle, each narrow escape from cavalry patrols that should have ended him. "Grey Wolf," Bull Reeves spat, his voice carrying the contempt born of fear. "That savage has killed more white men than smallpox. Should have been hanged years ago." "Hard to hang a ghost," old Pete observed from his piano bench, his voice raspy from decades of tobacco. "That's what the Comanche call him. Grey Wolf the Ghost. They say he can ride through a cavalry line invisible as smoke, that he can track a man across solid rock, that he speaks 7 languages including perfect English learned from a missionary he spared as a boy." "Superstitious nonsense," Hawkins scoffed, but his hand trembled slightly as he raised his glass. Charlotte noticed. She noticed everything. "He's just a man. Bleeds like any other when you put lead in him. Problem is getting close enough to try." Charlotte continued her work, wiping down the bar, refilling drinks, collecting coins. But her mind wandered to the stories she'd heard about Grey Wolf over her 3 years in redemption. Stories told in whispers by soldiers and settlers, each tale more fantastical than the last. Some said he stood 7 feet tall. Others claimed he could speak to animals. A few swore he could sense danger before it arrived, that he'd never been wounded in battle, despite dozens of encounters with armed men. She knew most of it was exaggeration, the kind of mythology that grew around any figure who operated in the spaces between civilization and wilderness. But she also knew that myths didn't spring from nothing. There had to be a man at the center of all those stories, a real person of flesh and blood and bone. "What do you think, Charlotte?" asked Tommy Reed, a young ranch hand who spent most of his wages at the Red Rose hoping for a smile from her. "You scared of the Comanche?" Charlotte paused, considering her words carefully. In a place like Redemption, careless talk could get you labeled a sympathizer or a coward, neither of which was good for business. "I think," she said slowly, "that everyone's trying to survive in their own way. The Comanche are fighting for land that was theirs. We're building towns and farms on it. Someone's going to lose, and it probably won't be us in the long run. But that doesn't mean the fighting won't be ugly before it's done." Several men shifted uncomfortably. Charlotte's honesty was one of her most dangerous qualities. In a world that preferred simple narratives of civilization versus savagery, good versus evil, her willingness to see complexity made people uneasy. "That's mighty philosophical for a saloon girl," Hawkins said, but there was curiosity rather than contempt in his voice. "You got education back east?" "Some," Charlotte admitted, remembering her father's better days when he'd hired tutors, before the gambling and drinking had consumed everything. "Enough to read, write, and cipher better than most." The conversation drifted to other topics as the afternoon wore into evening. More customers arrived as the sun sank toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. Cowboys from nearby ranches, merchants from the general store, drifters looking for work or whiskey or both. Charlotte moved through them like a dancer, balancing drinks and deflecting advances with equal skill. It was full dark when the stranger arrived. Charlotte saw him first, silhouetted in the doorway as he pushed through the swinging doors. He was tall, though not impossibly so, perhaps 6 feet. His build was lean and powerful, the kind of physique earned through constant physical challenge rather than leisure. He wore buckskin pants and a cotton shirt that had once been blue, but had faded to the color of storm clouds. His hair, black as a raven's wing, hung past his shoulders. His face was striking, all sharp angles and strong features, with eyes so dark they appeared black in the lamplight. But it was the way he moved that caught Charlotte's attention. He walked with the fluid grace of a predator, each step deliberate and controlled. His gaze swept the room with the practiced assessment of a man accustomed to evaluating threats and opportunities in an instant. The saloon fell silent. Conversations died mid-sentence. Old Pete's fingers froze on the piano keys. Every eye turned toward the newcomer, and Charlotte felt the temperature in the room drop despite the summer heat. The stranger seemed unbothered by the attention. He crossed to the bar with unhurried steps, his moccasins making barely a whisper against the wooden floor. When he reached Charlotte, he met her eyes directly, and she felt something shift inside her chest. His eyes weren't black, she realized, but the deepest brown, like earth after rain, and in them she saw intelligence, wariness, and something else she couldn't quite name. "Whiskey," he said. His English was flawless, without trace of accent, confirming at least one of old Pete's stories. Charlotte poured, her hand steady despite the tension crackling through the air like lightning before a storm. She set the glass before him, and when their fingers brushed accidentally, she felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with fear. "You're brave," she said quietly, "walking in here like this." His lips quirked in something that might have been a smile, or foolish. Sometimes hard to tell the difference. "I reckon that's true enough," Charlotte replied. "You got a name, stranger?" "Several," he said, taking a sip of the whiskey. "But I suspect you already know the one that matters." Before Charlotte could respond, Sergeant Hawkins lurched from his table, his hand dropping to his sidearm. "Grey Wolf," he said, the name half curse, half question. "You've got stones walking in here, I'll give you that. But you're either surrendering, or you're the stupidest Indian I've ever met." Grey Wolf turned slowly, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. "Neither," he said calmly. "I came to drink whiskey and perhaps hear some news. I have no quarrel with anyone here tonight." "No quarrel." Bull Reeves stood, his bulk making his chair scrape loudly against the floor. "You killed my partner last spring. Shot him through the heart during a raid on our buffalo camp." "Your partner," Grey Wolf said evenly, "was shooting buffalo calves for sport and leaving the meat to rot. When we asked him to stop, he fired on us. I fired back. He was slower." The truth of it hung in the air. Everyone in Redemption knew that buffalo hunters were exterminating the great herds with ruthless efficiency, destroying the Comanche's primary food source. It was strategy as much as economics, a way to starve the tribes into submission. Charlotte found herself speaking before she could think better of it. "He's one man having a drink. There are 20 of you with guns. If you start shooting in here, people will die, and I'll be the one cleaning blood off my floors. So how about everyone settles down, finishes their drinks, and saves the killing for outside my establishment?" Her voice carried an authority that surprised even herself. The men hesitated, caught between their hatred and their respect for the woman who ran the Red Rose. Charlotte had earned a reputation as someone you didn't cross lightly. She extended credit when times were hard, nursed men through illness, and kept confidences better than any priest. That goodwill bought her more power than any gun. Hawkins was the first to sit, followed grudgingly by the others, but hands stayed near weapons, and eyes remained fixed on Grey Wolf. Grey Wolf returned his attention to Charlotte, and she felt that strange awareness again, as if the air between them had become charged with electricity. "Thank you," he said simply. "That was either very brave or very foolish." "Seems we both have a problem telling the difference," Charlotte replied, refilling his glass. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady. Years of dealing with difficult men had taught her to project calm, even when fear whispered in her ear. "Perhaps," Grey Wolf said, a hint of amusement touching his features, "or perhaps we both simply understand that survival sometimes requires unusual choices." Charlotte leaned against the bar, studying him with open curiosity. Up close, she could see the scars that marked his arms and chest where his shirt fell open at the collar. These weren't the random marks of accident, but the deliberate wounds of battle. She'd seen enough violence in Redemption to recognize the difference. "You speak English like you were born to it," she observed, keeping her voice low enough that only he could hear over the resumed murmur of conversation. Old Pete had started playing again, though his melodies remained subdued. "Missionary named Father Benedict found me after a cavalry raid when I was 7, Grey Wolf explained, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. "My parents were dead, my sister taken to a reservation. He brought me to his mission, taught me to read and write, told me stories from his Bible. He was a good man, believed he was saving my soul." The warrior paused, his dark eyes distant with memory. "When I was 12, I ran away, returned to my people, to what remained of them. But Father Benedict's lessons stayed with me. Knowledge is a weapon, Charlotte, sometimes the most powerful one." She noticed he'd used her name, though she hadn't given it. "You've been listening to conversations about me." "I've been listening to conversations about everyone in Redemption for the past 3 days, Grey Wolf admitted. "I camped in the hills outside town, watched the comings and goings, learned who held power and who didn't. You're an interesting case. A woman alone running a business in a man's world, surviving through intelligence rather than submission. That takes more courage than most battles I've fought. Charlotte felt heat rise to her cheeks, surprised by the compliment and the insight behind it. Most men saw her as either an object of desire or a necessary convenience. Few recognized the constant strategy required to maintain her independence. 3 days, she repeated, her analytical mind catching on that detail. You could have been anywhere by now. Why risk coming into town? Grey Wolf's expression grew serious, the brief lightness evaporating. Because I need information, and sometimes the only way to get it is to ask directly. My band is running low on supplies. The army has pushed us farther north than we've ever ranged, into territory where game is scarce and water scarcer. We've avoided settlements as much as possible, but that's becoming harder. I need to know where the next cavalry patrol is heading, which routes they're watching. And you thought walking into a saloon full of your enemies was the best way to gather intelligence? Charlotte's eyebrow arched skeptically. I thought, Grey Wolf said, his gaze holding hers with uncomfortable intensity, that perhaps not everyone in Redemption sees this conflict the same way. Some people understand that there are no easy villains in this story, just desperate people trying to survive. Before Charlotte could respond, a commotion erupted near the door. A young woman burst through, her dress torn and dusty, her blonde hair tangled with leaves and debris. Blood streaked her face from a cut above her eye. She stumbled, and Tommy Reed caught her before she fell. Sarah Mitchell, someone gasped. My God, what happened? Sarah Mitchell was the daughter of Henry Mitchell, who ran the lumber mill on the edge of town. She was engaged to Lieutenant James Prescott from Fort Griffin, a match that had the whole town excited about the wedding planned for October. Indians, Sarah sobbed, clinging to Tommy. They attacked our wagon 5 miles south. Papa fought them off, but they wounded him badly. James went for help, but I ran until I found the road to town. The saloon exploded into action. Men grabbed weapons, shouting questions and orders. Sergeant Hawkins immediately began organizing a rescue party, his military training taking over. Charlotte saw Grey Wolf tense, his body coiling as if preparing to flee or fight. Their eyes met across the chaos, and in that moment, she made a decision that defied all logic. She moved closer, her body partially shielding him from view. The back door, she whispered urgently. Through the kitchen, into the alley. Go now before they remember you're here. Why? Grey Wolf asked, genuine confusion crossing his features. Why would you help me? Because, Charlotte said, the words tumbling out before she could examine them too closely. You're right. There are no easy villains here. And because I don't believe in mob justice, even when the mob might have a point. Now go before I change my mind or someone else makes it for me. For a heartbeat, Grey Wolf didn't move. Then he reached out, his calloused hand briefly touching hers where it rested on the bar. The contact lasted only a second, but Charlotte felt it like a brand. I won't forget this, he said quietly. Then he was moving, slipping through the crowd with that predatory grace, disappearing into the kitchen before anyone noticed. Charlotte turned her attention back to the chaos, helping organize supplies for the rescue party, tending to Sarah Mitchell's injuries with whiskey and clean cloth. But her mind kept returning to those few moments of connection with a man who should have been her enemy, wondering what madness had possessed her to help him escape. The rescue party thundered out of town 20 minutes later, leaving behind a handful of older men and women to guard Redemption. Charlotte continued working, serving drinks to nervous customers, listening to speculation about which Comanche band had attacked the Mitchells, whether it was part of a larger offensive, if the town itself was in danger. She retired to her small room above the saloon near midnight, exhausted but unable to sleep. Through her window, she could see the distant hills where Grey Wolf had said he'd been watching the town. Was he out there now, looking back at Redemption? Did he think about their conversation, their brief moment of understanding across an impossible divide? Charlotte had learned long ago not to indulge in romantic fantasies. Her life had taught her that survival required pragmatism, not dreams. She'd watched her father destroy himself chasing rainbows and illusions. She'd vowed never to be that foolish. But as she lay in the darkness, listening to the wind howl across the prairie, she couldn't stop thinking about intelligent brown eyes and a voice that spoke of survival and courage, couldn't stop wondering what it would be like to have a conversation with someone who saw her as more than just a pretty face serving whiskey. She finally drifted into restless sleep as dawn painted the eastern sky with streaks of gold and rose. The rescue party returned mid-morning with Henry Mitchell on a makeshift stretcher. The mill owner had taken an arrow through his shoulder and lost considerable blood, but the town doctor thought he'd survive. Lieutenant Prescott rode at the head of the group, his young face grim with barely contained rage. Charlotte heard the story in fragments as customers filtered into the Red Rose throughout the day. The attack had been quick and brutal. 3 Comanche warriors had come out of nowhere, firing arrows and rifles. Mitchell had managed to wound one before taking the arrow himself. His daughter had run while her father and fiancé fought. The warriors had taken 2 horses and several bags of supplies before disappearing into the landscape. It was Grey Wolf's band, Prescott announced that evening, standing in the center of the saloon like an avenging angel. One of the horses they stole had a distinctive brand. It was last seen at a ranch Grey Wolf raided 3 weeks ago. That savage is getting bolder, attacking so close to town. We need to organize a proper hunting party, track him down and end this threat permanently. Charlotte poured drinks and listened, her face carefully neutral. She noticed that Prescott seemed more concerned with revenge than with Sarah's well-being. The lieutenant hadn't visited his fiancée since returning, instead spending his time organizing volunteers for his hunting party. Grey Wolf was in this very saloon last night, Bull Reeves announced, his voice carrying over the crowd. Walked right in like he owned the place. We should have killed him then. Why didn't you? Asked a newcomer, a ranch hand Charlotte didn't recognize. Charlotte Hendricks convinced us not to start shooting, Hawkins admitted grudgingly. Said she didn't want blood on her floors. Then in all the commotion with Sarah Mitchell, the bastard slipped away. Eyes turned toward Charlotte, and she felt the weight of their suspicion. She met their gazes steadily, refusing to show fear or guilt. I run a business, she said evenly. Gunfights are bad for business. Men die, furniture gets destroyed, and then I'm the one left dealing with the mess and the consequences. If you want to kill each other, do it in the street. It was a reasonable explanation, and most of the men accepted it with grudging nods. But Charlotte noticed Lieutenant Prescott watching her with cold calculation in his blue eyes. He was young, but he wasn't stupid. He suspected something, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what. Be that as it may, Prescott said, his voice carrying an officer's authority. We're organizing a large-scale hunting party. 50 men, properly armed and supplied. We'll track Grey Wolf's band and eliminate them. I'm asking for volunteers. Hands shot up around the room. The attack on the Mitchells had stirred up fear and anger in equal measure. Men who might normally have stayed out of Indian conflicts suddenly wanted blood. Charlotte felt sick. She'd helped Grey Wolf escape, and now she'd inadvertently contributed to a massive manhunt. If they found his band, there would be a slaughter. Women and children didn't survive cavalry actions any better than warriors. That night, after the saloon closed, Charlotte did something she'd never done before. She saddled a horse from the stable behind the Red Rose and rode out of town toward the hills. It was insane, dangerous, probably suicidal, but she had to warn him. The moon hung full and bright, illuminating the landscape in shades of silver and shadow. Charlotte had never been much of a rider, but desperation lent her courage. She pushed the horse harder than was wise, following the rough trail into the broken country north of Redemption. She had no real plan, no idea where Grey Wolf might be camped. She simply rode toward where he'd said he'd been watching the town, hoping that somehow he'd find her before anyone else did. An hour into her ride, a figure materialized from behind a stand of mesquite. Charlotte's horse reared, and she barely managed to stay in the saddle. When she'd calmed the animal, she found herself staring at Grey Wolf, who'd appeared as silently as smoke. You ride out alone at night in hostile territory, he observed, though his tone carried concern rather than mockery. Either you're incredibly brave or you've lost your mind. Probably both, Charlotte admitted, her heart racing from the near fall and his sudden appearance. I had to warn you. They're organizing a hunting party, 50 men. Lieutenant Prescott is leading them. They think your band attacked Henry Mitchell's wagon yesterday. Grey Wolf's expression darkened. We didn't. My band is 40 miles north, camping near the Red River. We haven't raided in 2 weeks. Then who? Charlotte asked, confusion replacing her fear. Could be any number of bands. Could be Kiowa. Could be renegades from several tribes. Or, Grey Wolf paused, his jaw tightening. It could be white men dressed as Indians. It's happened before. Settlers looking to stir up trouble, to justify driving us out completely. The possibility hadn't occurred to Charlotte, but it made a sick kind of sense. Hatred bred deception, and there were plenty of people who'd profit from increased military action against the Comanche. You need to run, Charlotte urged. Get your people away from here. Prescott leaves in 2 days. Grey Wolf studied Charlotte in the moonlight, and she saw something shift in his expression. The wariness remained, but beneath it lay a dawning respect mixed with something warmer, something that made her breath catch in her throat. You risk everything to warn me, he said softly. Your reputation, your business, perhaps your life if anyone discovers you rode out here. Why, Charlotte? We barely know each other. Charlotte struggled to find words for feelings she didn't fully understand herself. Because what's happening here is wrong. Because I'm tired of watching people destroy each other over land and pride and fear. Because when I looked in your eyes last night, I didn't see a savage or a monster. I saw a man trying to protect his people the only way he knows how. She paused, then added with brutal honesty, and because I haven't had a real conversation with someone who saw me as a person rather than a possession in longer than I can remember. The words hung between them, more intimate than any touch. Grey Wolf stepped closer, and Charlotte noticed details she'd missed in the dim saloon light. A thin scar that traced his left cheekbone, the way his hair moved in the night breeze, the strength in his hands, capable of both violence and gentleness. I have seen you, Grey Wolf said, his voice low and intense. From the hills I watched you move through your town like a dancer navigating obstacles. I saw how men looked at you with hunger, how women watched with envy and resentment, how you held yourself apart from all of it. I watched and wondered what kind of woman could survive in such a place without losing herself completely. A stubborn one, Charlotte replied, trying to lighten the moment even as her heart hammered against her ribs. My father used to say I was too stubborn for my own good. Got me in trouble more times than I can count. Stubbornness is another word for strength, Grey Wolf countered. The willow bends but does not break. You remind me of the women in my band, the ones who hold our people together when the warriors are away fighting. They have that same fire in their eyes, that same refusal to surrender to circumstances they didn't choose. Charlotte found herself moving closer, drawn by something she couldn't name and didn't want to resist. Tell me about them, your people. Not the stories the soldiers tell, but the truth. Grey Wolf settled onto a flat rock, gesturing for Charlotte to sit beside him. She dismounted, tying her horse to a mesquite branch, and joined him. The stone still held the day's warmth, and sitting there under the vast Texas sky felt surreal, like existing outside normal time and space. My band numbers 43 souls, Grey Wolf began, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller. 15 warriors, 12 women, 16 children. We are what remains of a much larger group that once controlled territory from here to the mountains. The cavalry killed many. Disease took more. Some went to the reservations, choosing survival over freedom. Those of us who remain do so because we cannot imagine any other life. Don't you want peace? Charlotte asked. Don't you tire of constantly running, constantly fighting? Of course, Grey Wolf said, and the weariness in his voice was profound. I am tired, Charlotte. Tired of watching children go hungry because the buffalo herds are nearly gone. Tired of seeing warriors fall in battles we cannot win. Tired of moving camp every few days. Never able to rest. Never able to simply live. He turned to face her fully, and in the moonlight his eyes held depths of sorrow she hadn't expected. But what peace can we accept? The reservation is a slow death. Our people confined to barren land, dependent on government supplies that arrive late or not at all, forbidden from hunting or traveling, watched by soldiers who see us as animals to be contained. Charlotte had heard soldiers and settlers talk about reservations as generous gifts, as civilizing opportunities. Hearing Grey Wolf describe them stripped away those comfortable lies. So you choose this instead, running, fighting, knowing you'll probably lose in the end. We choose to die free rather than live in chains, Grey Wolf said simply. Is that so hard to understand? Would you accept a life where others controlled your every movement, where your children were taken to be educated in white schools that teach them to hate their own heritage, where your language and customs were forbidden? Charlotte thought about her own fight for independence, how she'd fled St. Louis rather than accept the life others had planned for her, how she'd worked herself nearly to exhaustion to maintain control over her own existence. No, she admitted quietly, I wouldn't accept that either. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the night sounds of the prairie surrounding them. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called and another answered. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust. Charlotte felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years, sitting beside a man who should have been her enemy, but felt more like a kindred spirit. You should go back, Grey Wolf said eventually, though his tone suggested he didn't want her to leave. Before anyone notices you're gone, if they discover you came here, they'll call you a traitor. Probably, Charlotte agreed, but she didn't move. Grey Wolf, what's your real name? Your Comanche name? He smiled, and it transformed his face, making him look younger, almost carefree. Tsina Mawa. It means Grey Wolf, but in my language, it carries meanings your tongue cannot quite capture. Wolf is clever, persistent, loyal to pack. Gray is the color of dawn and dusk, the in-between times when the world changes. My father gave me this name when I was 13, after my first vision quest. Tsina Mawa, Charlotte repeated carefully, stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds. Did I say it right? Close enough, he said, clearly pleased by her effort. What about you, Charlotte May Hendricks? Why did your parents choose these names? Charlotte after my grandmother, a woman I never met, but who was apparently even more stubborn than me. May because my mother loved the spring month. Hendricks was my father's name, though he didn't do much to honor it. He was a charming drunk who could shuffle cards like a magician but couldn't hold on to money or dignity. Charlotte surprised herself with the honesty. She rarely spoke of her father, of the pain and disappointment that had shaped her early years. But you honor his name, Grey Wolf observed. You could have changed it, started fresh in the West, yet you kept it. I kept it because I wanted to prove something, Charlotte explained, understanding it clearly for the first time as she spoke the words aloud. I wanted to prove that a Hendricks could make something of themselves, could be more than a cautionary tale whispered in gambling halls and saloons. Foolish pride, probably. Not foolish, Grey Wolf said firmly. Pride in surviving, in building something from nothing that is never foolish. You should be proud, Charlotte. You have accomplished what many men twice your age could not. The compliment warmed her more than it should have. Charlotte realized with a start that she was dangerously close to developing feelings for this man, this Comanche warrior whose life existed in complete opposition to everything her world represented. It was madness. It was impossible. It was perhaps the most honest connection she'd ever felt. I need to ask you something, Charlotte said, turning to face him fully. And I need you to tell me the truth. The attack on Henry Mitchell, could any of your warriors have done it without your knowledge? Could someone have acted independently? Grey Wolf considered the question seriously, his warrior's mind analyzing possibilities. It is possible, but unlikely. Our band is small, tight-knit. Everyone knows we cannot afford reckless actions. Any raid is planned carefully, discussed by the council. But, he paused, his expression troubled, there is a young warrior named Swift Arrow, who lost his wife and child in a cavalry attack last winter. He has been angry, speaking of revenge, wanting to strike back at any whites regardless of the consequences. I have tried to counsel patience to remind him that rage without strategy leads only to death, but grief makes men do foolish things. Could he have attacked the Mitchells? Charlotte pressed. He could have, Grey Wolf admitted reluctantly, but he would have needed to slip away from camp, which means others would have noticed. When I return, I will ask questions, investigate. If Swift Arrow acted without permission, there will be consequences. Our survival depends on discipline. Charlotte absorbed this, her mind already working through implications. If it was Swift Arrow, and if Prescott's hunting party finds your camp, they won't care about distinctions. They'll kill everyone they can. I know, Grey Wolf said, his voice heavy. Which is why I must return tonight, move the camp immediately. We'll go deeper into the Llano Estacado, the staked plains. It's harsh country, but we know it better than any cavalry. We can disappear there. The thought of him leaving created an unexpected ache in Charlotte's chest. When will I see you again? The question was bold, presumptuous even. It assumed a future neither of them had a right to expect. But Grey Wolf didn't mock her or point out the impossibility. Instead, he reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently touched her face. His hand was warm, calloused from years of riding and fighting, but his touch carried surprising gentleness. I will return, he promised. I don't know when or how, but I will find a way. You have given me something I thought I had lost forever, Charlotte. Hope that not all whites see us as vermin to be exterminated. Hope that understanding might exist somewhere between our peoples. Hope that perhaps, he hesitated, vulnerability crossing his strong features, that what I feel stirring between us might be more than impossible foolishness. Charlotte covered his hand with hers, holding it against her cheek. It is impossible foolishness, she whispered, but I feel it too, and I'm tired of always being practical, always doing what makes sense. Just this once I want to do something because it feels right, even if it's wrong in every other way. She wasn't sure who moved first, but suddenly they were kissing, and it was nothing like the fumbling, grabbing encounters Charlotte had endured from drunk customers. This kiss was slow, exploratory, filled with a hunger that had nothing to do with conquest and everything to do with connection. Grey Wolf's hands tangled in her hair, and she pressed closer, wanting to memorize this moment to carry it with her through whatever came next. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Charlotte felt transformed. She'd been kissed before, had even enjoyed it occasionally, but this was different. This felt like finding something she hadn't known she'd been searching for. You need to go, Grey Wolf said, though his arms remained around her. Dawn isn't far, and you have a long ride back. Come with me, Charlotte said impulsively. Not to town, but closer. There's an old line shack about 3 miles east of Redemption. Nobody uses it anymore. You could hide there, and I could bring you supplies, information. That would put you in even more danger, Grey Wolf protested. I'm already in danger, Charlotte countered. I've already chosen a side by warning you. Might as well go all in. Besides, she added with a wry smile, I'm stubborn, remember? Once I've decided on something, I see it through. Grey Wolf studied her for a long moment, then nodded. 3 days. Give me 3 days to move my people to safety, to investigate what Swift Arrow may have done, to make arrangements. Then I will come to this line shack, and we will talk more, plan more, figure out if this impossible thing between us has any chance of becoming real. Charlotte memorized his face in the moonlight, committing every detail to memory. Then she mounted her horse, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was, how insane this entire night had been. Charlotte, Grey Wolf called as she prepared to ride away. You said you need a woman like you. Bold, stubborn, willing to see beyond easy answers. You were right. I do. The words referenced their first meeting when she'd stood between him and a room full of armed men. Charlotte smiled, feeling something warm and fierce bloom in her chest. Then I guess you'd better come back, Tsina Mawa. She rode hard through the darkness, reaching Redemption just as the eastern sky began to lighten. She stabled her horse, cleaned up as best she could, and opened the Red Rose for business as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But everything had changed. Charlotte moved through her day with secret knowledge burning in her heart, aware that she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She'd fallen for a Comanche warrior, and somehow, against all logic and reason, he'd fallen for her too. The next 3 days passed with agonizing slowness. Charlotte went through the motions of running the Red Rose, serving drinks and managing customers, while her mind remained fixed on the line shack 3 miles east of town. Lieutenant Prescott's hunting party had departed on schedule, 50 armed men riding north with grim determination. Charlotte watched them go with a mixture of relief and dread, praying that Grey Wolf had moved his people quickly enough. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Charlotte closed the saloon early, claiming a headache. It wasn't entirely a lie. The stress of maintaining her facade while harboring such dangerous secrets had left her genuinely exhausted. She packed supplies into saddlebags, dried beef, bread, coffee, ammunition she'd purchased discreetly from different merchants so no one would notice the quantity, and rode out as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The line shack stood in a hollow surrounded by cottonwood trees, far enough from main trails to offer privacy, but close enough to redemption for Charlotte to reach it without raising suspicions. The structure had been built years ago by ranchers running cattle through the area, but changing grazing patterns had made it obsolete. Now it served as occasional shelter for travelers, or apparently, clandestine meetings between people who had no business meeting at all. Charlotte's heart leaped when she saw smoke rising from the shack's chimney. He'd come. Despite everything, despite the danger and impossibility, Grey Wolf had kept his promise. She dismounted and pushed open the weathered door. Grey Wolf stood near the fireplace, and Charlotte's breath caught at the sight of him. In the warm light, he looked both wild and civilized, comfortable in his own skin in a way she envied. He'd bathed recently, his long hair still damp, and wore clean buckskin clothing, but it was his eyes that captured her attention, those intelligent, watchful eyes that now warmed with genuine pleasure at seeing her. "Charlotte," he said, her name a caress on his lips, "I was beginning to fear you'd changed your mind." "I'm stubborn, remember?" Charlotte replied, setting down her saddlebags. "Besides, I brought supplies. Couldn't let you starve while we figure out this mess." Grey Wolf helped her unpack, and they worked in comfortable silence, the ease between them remarkable given how little time they'd actually spent together. When the supplies were stored, Grey Wolf gestured to a blanket he'd spread near the fire. "Sit with me," he said. "I have much to tell you, and I fear not all of it is good." Charlotte settled beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. The contact sent warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. "Tell me." "I confronted Swift Arrow," Grey Wolf began, his voice heavy. "He admitted to the attack on Henry Mitchell's wagon. He said he acted alone, wanting to strike back at the whites who killed his family. He took the horses and supplies to prove his courage, to show that we could still fight." Grey Wolf's hands clenched into fists. His actions were brave and utterly foolish. He has endangered the entire band with his recklessness. "What did you do?" Charlotte asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "I exiled him," Grey Wolf said flatly. "Banishment is the harshest punishment we can impose short of death. Swift Arrow must leave the band, survive alone, and may never return. It broke my heart to do it. He is young, still grieving, and now he faces the wilderness without the support of his people. But I had no choice. Our survival depends on discipline, on thinking beyond individual desire for revenge." Charlotte absorbed this, understanding the weight of such a decision. "Will he survive alone?" "Perhaps," Grey Wolf said, uncertainty clear in his voice. "He is a skilled warrior, but the frontier is unforgiving to those without a band. I gave him weapons, a horse, and what supplies I could spare. The rest is up to him and the spirits." He turned to Charlotte, his expression intense. "But this also means something important. The attack on Mitchell was not part of any organized campaign. It was the action of one grieving man. Perhaps with this knowledge, the hunt for my people might be called off." Charlotte's analytical mind immediately began working through possibilities. If we could prove Swift Arrow acted alone, if we could show Prescott and the others that your band wasn't responsible, it might stop the bloodshed. But how? Who would believe a saloon owner claiming to have inside knowledge of Comanche decision-making? "There is another complication," Grey Wolf continued, his voice dropping lower. "I encountered a group of white men while scouting the area yesterday. They were camped in an arroyo south of here, dressed in buckskin and war paint, carrying Comanche weapons. When they didn't know I was watching, I heard them speaking English, planning another raid on a settlement east of Redemption. They spoke of making it look like Indian work, of stirring up more hatred, more calls for military action." The revelation hit Charlotte like a physical blow. White men pretending to be Comanche? But why? "Land," Grey Wolf said simply. "Fear drives settlers away, makes property cheap. Someone profits from the chaos. I've suspected this for months, heard rumors from other bands, but this is the first time I've seen it with my own eyes." His jaw tightened with barely controlled anger. "My people die for crimes we didn't commit. while white men in war paint enrich themselves on blood and terror. Charlotte's mind raced, piecing together implications. If we could expose them, capture them, or at least provide proof of what they're doing, it would change everything. People would have to question the narrative they've been fed. It would be dangerous, Grey Wolf warned. These men won't surrender peacefully. They have too much to lose. And if we're caught together, Charlotte, you'll be branded a traitor. At best, you'd be exiled. At worst, he didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what frontier justice looked like for those deemed traitors to their race. Charlotte met his eyes, seeing her own determination reflected back. I didn't ride out here 3 nights ago just to turn back now. I'm in this, Grey Wolf. Whatever comes next, I'm in it with you. The warrior reached out, cupping her face with both hands, his touch reverent. You are remarkable, Charlotte May Hendricks. In another life, another time, perhaps we could have simply been a man and woman meeting, falling in love, building a life together. But the world we inhabit makes that impossible. Then we make a new world, Charlotte said fiercely. Or at least try. I'm tired of accepting that things have to be the way they've always been. Someone has to start changing the story, even if it's just 2 people refusing to hate each other. Grey Wolf kissed her then, and it was different from their first kiss. This held desperation mixed with tenderness, hunger tempered by the knowledge that time was running out. Charlotte responded with equal intensity, her hands sliding up his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Grey Wolf rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said quietly, the words carrying the weight of absolute truth. I know it's too soon, too fast, too impossible. But I have looked death in the face enough times to know that some truths cannot wait for convenient moments. I love you, Charlotte, and whether we have days or decades, I want you to know that. Tears pricked Charlotte's eyes, but they were tears of joy mixed with sorrow for all they couldn't have. I love you too, she whispered. I've been alone for so long, surviving but not really living. You make me want to live again, to hope again, even if it's foolish. They held each other as the fire crackled and darkness settled fully outside the shack. Eventually, practical concerns reasserted themselves. They needed a plan, a way to expose the White Raiders and clear Grey Wolf's band of false accusations. The men you saw, Charlotte said, her strategic mind engaging. Could you find their camp again? Easily, Grey Wolf confirmed. They've settled in for several days, it seems, building up supplies, planning their next move. Then we gather evidence, Charlotte proposed. We document what they're doing, perhaps capture one alive to testify. And we need someone from town who would believe us, someone with authority who isn't so blinded by hatred that they can't see the truth. Grey Wolf looked skeptical. Is there such a person in Redemption? Charlotte thought carefully through the town's population, weighing options. Maybe. Judge Callahan is old, set in his ways, but he prides himself on fairness. He's sentenced white men as harshly as Indians when the evidence warranted it. And there's Dr. Brennan, who treats everyone regardless of race. He's spoken privately about the injustice of how the Comanche are being pushed out. Between those two, if we can present undeniable proof, it's a desperate gamble, Grey Wolf observed. Everything about us is a desperate gamble, Charlotte countered with a slight smile. Might as well gamble on something that could actually make a difference. They spent the next several hours planning, working out details, anticipating problems. Grey Wolf would scout the Raiders' camp more thoroughly, gathering information about their numbers and capabilities. Charlotte would discreetly approach Judge Callahan and Dr. Brennan, testing their willingness to hear evidence that contradicted accepted narratives. If both men seemed receptive, they'd arrange for a confrontation that would expose the Raiders. As dawn approached, Charlotte knew she needed to return to Redemption before her absence was noticed. She stood reluctantly, hating to leave the warmth and safety of the shack, of Grey Wolf's presence. He walked her to her horse, helping her mount, his hands lingering on her waist. Be careful, he urged. Watch for anyone following you. Trust no one completely except Callahan and Brennan, and even them only after you're certain of their character. Same to you, Charlotte replied. Those raiders won't hesitate to kill you if they discover you've been watching them. Grey Wolf smiled, and it carried the confidence of a man who'd survived countless dangers. I am Grey Wolf the Ghost, remember? I'll be careful. His expression softened. 3 days again. Meet me here and we'll finalize our plan. Charlotte leaned down from the saddle, kissing him one more time, trying to pour everything she felt into that contact. 3 days, she agreed. And then we change everything, or die trying. She rode back to Redemption as the sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, her heart full of hope and terror in equal measure. The next 3 days tested every bit of her courage and cunning. She approached Judge Callahan on the pretense of asking legal advice about her saloon business, then carefully steered the conversation toward frontier justice and the treatment of the Comanche. The judge was cautious but revealed a thoughtful perspective, admitting that sometimes expedience overshadows truth, and when that happens, everyone loses their humanity. Dr. Brennan was even more receptive. He'd treated wounded from both sides of the conflict and had grown disgusted with the cycle of violence. Someone's profiting from keeping this war going, he said bluntly when Charlotte hinted at her knowledge. Follow the money, and you'll usually find the real villains. On the 3rd day, Charlotte received devastating news. Lieutenant Prescott's hunting party had returned empty-handed, but they'd encountered another homestead attack en route. This time, 3 people were dead, including a woman and her teenage son. The supposed Comanche raiders had left clear tracks, practically begging to be followed. The town was in an uproar. Calls for total war echoed through the streets. Even previously moderate voices now demanded extermination of all Indians in the territory. Charlotte felt the window for peace closing rapidly. She rode to the line shack that evening, desperate to share the news with Grey Wolf and accelerate their plan. But when she arrived, she found the shack empty except for a note weighted down with a stone. Grey Wolf's English writing was careful and clear. Charlotte, the raiders moved their camp. I am tracking them to their new location. If I don't return by sunrise, go to Judge Callahan. Tell him everything. The truth matters more than my life or yours. Whatever happens, know that loving you was the best thing I ever did. Tsina Mawa. Terror gripped Charlotte's heart. Grey Wolf was out there alone, tracking dangerous men who wouldn't hesitate to kill him. She paced the shack, torn between riding blindly into the night to search for him and trusting his skills, his experience. She waited. Minutes stretched into hours. The fire burned low, and Charlotte rebuilt it, needing something to do with her shaking hands. She dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound outside. Dawn broke cold and clear, and Grey Wolf still hadn't returned. Charlotte's decision crystallized. She would honor his instructions. She would go to Judge Callahan and tell him everything, regardless of the consequences. If Grey Wolf had been captured or killed, the truth he'd discovered couldn't die with him. She was saddling her horse when she heard hoofbeats approaching fast. Charlotte's hand went to the pistol she'd started carrying, her heart hammering. Then Grey Wolf burst into the clearing, riding hard, another horse on a lead rope behind him, and tied across that second horse, unconscious but clearly alive, was a white man dressed in buckskin and war paint. "We need to move now," Grey Wolf called out, barely slowing. "His partners know I took him. They'll be coming hard and fast. Get on your horse, Charlotte. We're going to Redemption, and we're going to end this today." Charlotte didn't hesitate. She mounted and rode alongside Grey Wolf, the unconscious raider bouncing on the horse between them. They pushed the animals hard, racing toward Redemption as the sun climbed higher. "What happened?" Charlotte shouted over the thunder of hooves. "I found their new camp," Grey Wolf shouted back. "This one separated from the group to scout. I took him down quietly, tied him up. But one of his partners spotted me. I had to run, and they're not far behind." They reached the outskirts of Redemption by mid-morning. People stopped and stared as Grey Wolf and Charlotte rode down the main street, the unconscious man between them making a bizarre sight. Charlotte headed straight for the courthouse where Judge Callahan held his offices. Sergeant Hawkins and several other armed men moved to intercept them, weapons drawn. "Grey Wolf!" Hawkins snarled. "You've got nerve showing your face here. And Charlotte, what the hell are you doing?" "Stop talking and start listening," Charlotte commanded with authority that made even Hawkins pause. "Judge Callahan needs to see this man immediately. And Dr. Brennan. This is about the raids, about who's really behind them." Judge Callahan emerged from the courthouse, drawn by the commotion. His weathered face showed surprise, but also sharp curiosity. "Miss Hendricks, you'd better have a damn good explanation for this spectacle." "I do, Your Honor," Charlotte said, dismounting. "This man and his partners have been conducting raids dressed as Comanche, deliberately stirring up hatred and fear. Grey Wolf captured him. We have proof, and we need you to hear it before this town lynches the wrong people." Dr. Brennan arrived, having heard the commotion from his nearby office. Between the judge, the doctor, Charlotte's reputation, and the sheer audacity of the claim, enough curiosity was stirred that people held back from immediate violence. They moved the unconscious raider into the courthouse, laying him on a table in the judge's chambers. Dr. Brennan revived him with smelling salts, and when the man's eyes fluttered open, he found himself surrounded by townsfolk, Judge Callahan, and a very much alive Grey Wolf. Under questioning, with the judge's stern authority and the implicit threat of frontier justice, the raider broke. His name was Charlie Benson, and he'd been hired by a syndicate of land speculators operating out of Austin. The plan was simple and evil: conduct raids dressed as Indians, drive settlers from valuable land, then purchase it cheap through intermediaries. They'd been operating for months, getting rich while Comanche took the blame and died for crimes they didn't commit. The confession sent shockwaves through Redemption. People wanted to disbelieve it, but the evidence was overwhelming. Benson gave names, dates, locations. Dr. Brennan examined the man's belongings and found correspondence proving the conspiracy. When Benson's partners rode into town that afternoon, still painted and dressed as Comanche, they were captured immediately. The truth spread rapidly. Not everyone accepted it, but enough did that the momentum toward total war faltered. Judge Callahan sent riders to recall Lieutenant Prescott's hunting party and dispatched messages to Fort Griffin detailing the conspiracy. Through it all, Charlotte and Grey Wolf stood together, facing the town as a united front. Some glared with hatred, others looked confused, their worldview shaken. A few nodded with something like respect. "This doesn't solve everything," Judge Callahan said privately to Charlotte and Grey Wolf that evening. "There's still tremendous tension, still legitimate grievances on both sides, but it's a start, a crack in the wall of hatred." "It's enough," Grey Wolf said, his hand finding Charlotte's. "Enough to build on, enough to give people on both sides who want peace something to point to." Lieutenant Prescott returned 3 days later, furious at being recalled but unable to deny the evidence. The captured raiders were sent to Austin for trial, where they would ultimately be convicted and hanged. The land speculation conspiracy expanded, reaching all the way to the territorial legislature, sparking reforms and investigations. But the personal aftermath was complicated. Charlotte's relationship with Grey Wolf was now public knowledge, and opinion in Redemption was divided. Some customers boycotted the Red Rose. Others, inspired by her courage, became even more loyal. The Saloon survived, though Charlotte knew things would never be quite the same. Grey Wolf faced his own challenges. His band, grateful that the immediate threat had passed, nonetheless struggled with his attachment to a white woman. Some saw it as betrayal, others as pragmatic bridge building. The tribe's elders agreed to a tentative peace, establishing communication channels with Redemption's leadership. On a warm evening 2 months after the confrontation, Charlotte and Grey Wolf stood outside the line shack that had become their sanctuary. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the kind of beauty that made everything else seem small and manageable. "I've been offered a position," Grey Wolf said, his arm around Charlotte's waist. "Mediator between my people and the settlements. Judge Callahan suggested it. The Army is actually considering it, believe it or not. It would mean spending time in both worlds, translating not just words but intentions, trying to prevent the misunderstandings that lead to violence." "That's important work," Charlotte said, pride evident in her voice. "You'd be good at it. I want you with me," Grey Wolf continued, turning to face her fully. "Not hidden away, not apologizing for what we are to each other. I want to marry you, Charlotte, by whatever laws and ceremonies we can manage. I want to build a life together, even if that life looks different from what either of our peoples expects." Charlotte felt tears of joy streaming down her face. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes to all of it. It won't be easy, people will talk, some will hate us for it, but I've discovered something important. I'd rather have a complicated life with you than an easy life with anyone else." They married 3 weeks later, in a ceremony that combined Comanche traditions and Christian elements, performed by Father Benedict, the missionary who had taught Grey Wolf English so many years ago. The old priest had traveled 100 miles to officiate, moved by the symbolism of two worlds joining. Judge Callahan attended, as did Dr. Brennan and a surprising number of Redemption's citizens. Representatives from Grey Wolf's band were there too, including some who'd initially opposed the union but came to honor their warrior's choice. Charlotte wore a dress of white buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork, a gift from the women of Grey Wolf's band, who'd worked on it for weeks. Grey Wolf wore traditional Comanche wedding garments, his long hair braided with eagle feathers. They exchanged vows in both English and Comanche, their voices steady with certainty. The reception was held at the Red Rose, which Charlotte had transformed for the occasion. Cowboys danced with Comanche women. Soldiers shared drinks with warriors. It wasn't paradise, and tensions still simmered beneath the surface. But for one evening, peace felt possible. As Charlotte danced with her husband under lantern light, surrounded by people from both their worlds, she thought about the journey that had brought them here. She'd come to Texas seeking independence and found something far more valuable, a partnership that challenged and inspired her, a love that refused to be constrained by the narrow definitions others tried to impose. "What are you thinking?" Grey Wolf asked, his hand warm against her back as they swayed to old Pete's piano music. "That you were right," Charlotte replied, smiling up at him. "I am exactly the kind of woman you need. Stubborn, brave, unwilling to accept that things have to stay the way they've always been." Grey Wolf laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "And you were right, too. I needed someone who could see beyond easy answers, who could recognize humanity in unexpected places. You've given me hope, Charlotte. Real hope that our peoples might find a way forward together." "Not just hope," Charlotte corrected, looking around at the mixed gathering. "Proof. We're living proof that understanding is possible, that love can bridge even the widest divides. It won't be easy, and we won't solve everything. But we've started something here. Tsina Mahwa. Something that matters." They kissed as the song ended, and the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. In that moment, surrounded by friends and former enemies, Charlotte felt truly free for the first time in her life. She'd found her place not by accepting the world as it was, but by daring to imagine what it could be. Grey Wolf and Charlotte would spend the next decades as mediators, advocates and symbols of what was possible when people chose understanding over hatred. Their work would contribute to peaceful resettlement agreements, protect Comanche rights, and gradually shift attitudes in both communities. They would face setbacks and heartbreak, lose friends to violence and disease, struggle with prejudice that never fully disappeared. But they would face it together, their love a constant anchor in turbulent times. They would raise children who belonged to both worlds and neither, teaching them to honor all their heritage. They would grow old side by side, their story becoming legend, proof that even in the bloodiest chapters of history, hope and love could still flourish. Years later, when asked about that first night in the Red Rose Saloon, Charlotte would smile and say, "I told him he needed a woman like me, bold, stubborn, unwilling to accept easy lies. And I was right. We both needed someone brave enough to see beyond what we were supposed to believe. We found each other across an impossible divide, and we chose love over fear. That choice changed everything." And Grey Wolf, his hair silver with age but his eyes still sharp and intelligent, would add, "She saved my life that night, though neither of us knew it then. Not just by warning me about the hunting party, but by reminding me that humanity exists everywhere if you're brave enough to look for it. Charlotte taught me that peace is built one relationship at a time, one act of courage at a time. She was, and is, the best thing that ever happened to me." Their legacy would outlive them, inspiring generations to come, proving that love and courage could indeed change the world, one stubborn, beautiful choice at a time.